bell's shrill cry echoed through the cold, fluorescent-lit hallways of Lincoln High School, signaling the end of another mundane history class. Students shuffled out, their voices blending into an incoherent murmur of relief and hurried conversations. The air smelled of chalk dust, old textbooks, and the faintest hint of cafeteria pizza lingering from lunchtime. Seated near the back of the classroom, Elijah Carter remained still, his fingers gripping the frayed edge of his worn-out notebook. He was used to this feeling, the weight pressing on his chest, the sting of humiliation burning in his throat. He hadn't done anything wrong. He never did. But that didn't matter, not to Ms. Patricia Whitman. Ms. Whitman stood at the front of the class, her sharp blue eyes scanning the students as they filed out. She was an institution at Lincoln High, having taught history there for over 2 decades. To most, she was an articulate, well-dressed woman with a no-nonsense demeanor. But Elijah knew better. He had felt the sting of her words before. "Mr. Carter," she called, her voice cutting through the hum of departing students. The remaining few glanced back before hurrying away, unwilling to be caught in whatever storm was brewing. Elijah swallowed and stood up, his tall frame rigid. "Yes, ma'am," he said, forcing his voice to remain steady. Ms. Whitman crossed her arms, a smirk twitching at the corner of her thin lips. "I graded your test last night," she said, waving a paper in front of him. The big, bold red F, scrawled across the top, stood out like a wound. "It seems history isn't exactly your strong suit." Elijah's jaw tightened. He had studied for that test, had spent hours poring over the material. He knew he had done well. "I don't understand," he said, his voice quieter now. Ms. Whitman sighed dramatically, shaking her head. "Some people just don't have the capacity to grasp certain subjects," she said, her gaze lingering on him with an unmistakable edge. "Maybe you should consider something less challenging. Something more suited to your background." Elijah's hands clenched at his sides. The meaning in her words was clear. He had heard it before from people like her, people who saw his skin before they saw his intelligence. He forced a breath into his lungs, reminding himself to stay calm. "I'd like to see my test," he said, reaching for the paper. Ms. Whitman pulled it back with a shake of her head. "No need to argue, Mr. Carter. The grade stands. I suggest you focus on a trade instead of dreaming too big." Elijah bit the inside of his cheek, tasting the bitterness of injustice. He met her gaze and, for the first time, didn't look away. Someday, he told himself, someday this moment won't define me. He had no idea how soon that day would come. The school hallways emptied quickly after the final bell, but Elijah Carter remained at his desk, staring at the failing grade in his hands. The sharp red ink seemed to bleed into the page, mocking him, taunting him. He had known Ms. Whitman harbored prejudice. She never missed an opportunity to undermine him in subtle ways. But this was blatant. He took a slow, measured breath, willing himself to stay calm. "Eli, man, you good?" Elijah looked up to see Marcus Reynolds, his best friend, leaning against the doorway. Marcus was all easy smiles and confidence, but the concern in his dark eyes was unmistakable. Elijah hesitated before shoving the paper into his backpack. "Yeah, just tired." Marcus wasn't buying it. His gaze flicked toward Ms. Whitman, who sat at her desk, pretending to grade papers. They both knew she was listening. "Let's go," Marcus said, jerking his chin toward the door. Elijah nodded and followed, the weight of injustice pressing on his chest like a cinder block. That evening, Elijah sat at the worn dining table in his small apartment, his mother, Danielle Carter, bustling around the tiny kitchen. The scent of roasted chicken filled the air, but Elijah barely touched his food. Danielle glanced at him. "What's wrong, baby?" Elijah hesitated, but the words tumbled out before he could stop them. "Ms. Whitman failed me on the history test." Danielle's brows furrowed. "Failed? But you studied." "I know. That's the thing, I know I did well. But she won't let me see my test." Silence stretched between them. His mother's eyes darkened, the same fire in them that he had seen 100 times before when the world tried to put limits on him. "This ain't about a test, is it?" she said softly. Elijah shook his head. She told me I should stick to a trade. That history wasn't meant for people like me. Danielle set the dish towel down, her hands shaking slightly. She said that. Elijah nodded. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, in a quiet but firm voice, she asked, "What do you want to do about it?" Elijah exhaled. "I want to prove her wrong." Danielle smiled then, the kind of smile that carried both pride and sorrow. "Then do it." That night, Elijah sat at his desk, flipping through his textbook. He wasn't just reading, he was studying with a vengeance, absorbing every historical fact, every detail. If Ms. Whitman wanted to challenge him, he would make sure she never got the last word. But something gnawed at him. The grade wasn't just about a test. It was about power, about control. If she could change his grades now, what was stopping her from doing it again? Determined, he made a decision. The next morning, he marched into the principal's office. Principal Harris, a middle-aged black man with graying hair, looked up as Elijah entered. "Mr. Carter, what brings you here?" Elijah set his backpack down and met the man's gaze. "I need to report Ms. Whitman." Harris leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "For what?" Elijah took a deep breath and told him everything. The failing grade, the withheld test, the veiled racism. When he finished, the office was silent. Principal Harris sighed and rubbed his temple. "I hear you, Elijah," he said, his voice measured. "But accusations like these aren't easy to prove. If I confront Ms. Whitman, she'll say you simply misunderstood her." Elijah's fists clenched. "So you're saying there's nothing I can do?" Harris studied him for a long moment before shaking his head. "I'm saying you need to be strategic." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "You're about to graduate. Focus on your future. Get into college. Succeed in ways she never thought possible. That's how you win." Elijah stared at him, feeling a slow fire ignite in his chest. Harris was right, he needed to think bigger. He had no idea just how soon that opportunity would come. Days passed, but Elijah Carter refused to let Ms. Whitman's words fade into the background. Every time he sat in her classroom, he could feel her eyes on him, watching, waiting for him to slip up. She wanted him to fail, and yet he didn't. Instead of retreating, he leaned in. He spent late nights in the library, poring over history books until the words blurred. He asked intelligent questions in class, ones that forced Ms. Whitman to acknowledge his grasp of the subject. He knew she hated it, hated that he wasn't the unmotivated, aimless student she wanted him to be. But Elijah wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. Word had spread about what happened. Other black students started coming to him with their own stories. Low grades that didn't match their efforts, comments laced with condescension. It wasn't just about one test, it was about a pattern. Elijah wasn't sure what to do with that weight on his shoulders. He wasn't a leader. He wasn't an activist. He was just a kid trying to make it out. Until one moment changed everything. It was a Friday afternoon, and Ms. Whitman was giving another lecture on American history. Elijah listened, arms crossed, as she spoke about the civil rights movement. There was something sickening about hearing her talk about Martin Luther King Jr. while knowing how she treated the very students he fought for. Then she said it. And while Martin Luther King Jr. had noble ideas, one could argue that change came more from the policymakers than the protesters. Elijah's head snapped up. A murmur spread across the classroom. Marcus shot him a look from across the aisle. "Don't do it, man." But Elijah was done staying silent. He raised his hand. "Ms. Whitman, that's not true." She turned to him, eyebrows raised. "Excuse me?" Elijah sat forward. The protests forced policymakers to act. Without the marches, the sit-ins, the boycotts, there wouldn't have been national attention. Change didn't happen because of policy alone. It happened because people demanded it. Ms. Whitman's face tightened. "That's an opinion, Mr. Carter." "It's history," Elijah countered. "And if I remember correctly, we're in a history class." A few students chuckled. Ms. Whitman's face flushed. "Enough," she snapped. "Since you're so confident in your knowledge, Mr. Carter, why don't you stay after class and explain to me exactly why you think you deserve to question my authority?" Elijah's stomach twisted. He knew what this was. Another chance for her to remind him of his place. But something in him refused to back down. "Fine," he said. After class, the room emptied out until it was just Elijah and Ms. Whitman. She sat at her desk, fingers laced together. "You think you're special, don't you?" she said quietly. Elijah frowned. "I think I deserve to be treated fairly." Ms. Whitman laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Life isn't fair, Mr. Carter. People like you always want things handed to them. But the truth is, you'll never be on the same level as students who actually belong here." The words were a slap. Elijah's jaw clenched. "I do belong here." Ms. Whitman leaned back, smirking. "We'll see about that. I'll be watching to see how far you make it." For the first time, Elijah wasn't just angry. He was determined. "You won't have to wait long," he said, gripping the strap of his backpack. "One day, you'll regret every word you've said to me." Ms. Whitman just smirked, dismissing him with a wave. "Run along now, Mr. Carter. Let the real scholars work." Elijah turned on his heel and left, his heart pounding. He had never been more sure of what he had to do. A few weeks later, everything changed. Elijah had been applying to every college and internship he could find. He didn't just want to prove Ms. Whitman wrong. He wanted to build a future that no one could take from him. Then, one day, his phone buzzed with an email that made his breath catch. His stomach flipped. The name couldn't be a coincidence. He opened the email, scanning the details. It was an internship for a prestigious historical research firm. A paid opportunity. A stepping stone to something bigger. And the name at the bottom of the email? Elijah nearly laughed. It was fate. The day of the interview, Elijah walked into the sleek glass building with his head held high. He had studied. He had prepared. He was ready. A receptionist led him into a conference room, and moments later, the door opened. Ms. Whitman walked in. She froze when she saw him. For the first time, Elijah saw something he had never seen in her before: uncertainty. He smiled, calm and confident. "Good afternoon, Ms. Whitman." Her lips pressed together. "Mr. Carter." Elijah gestured to the chair across from him. "Please have a seat. Let's discuss your qualifications." Her face paled, and for the first time she was the one at a disadvantage. For the first time in their long and contentious history, Elijah Carter sat across from Ms. Patricia Whitman, and she wasn't the one in control. The office was silent, the tension thick. The only sounds were the faint ticking of the wall clock and the distant hum of office chatter outside the glass-walled conference room. Ms. Whitman's eyes darted to the nameplate on the table, her face betraying a flicker of disbelief. She cleared her throat, attempting to regain composure. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice clipped but steady. "I wasn't aware you were conducting the interviews for this position." Elijah leaned back in his chair, folding his hands on the table. He let the moment stretch, watching her squirm. "You wouldn't be," he said calmly. "I was recently promoted within the internship selection committee. I help decide who gets an opportunity here." Her fingers tightened around the resume she held. The irony was almost poetic. Ms. Whitman, the woman who had dismissed him, belittled him, told him he'd never make it, was now sitting before him, hoping for his approval. A younger, angrier version of Elijah would have relished this moment, would have wanted to throw her words back in her face, to humiliate her the way she had humiliated him. But Elijah wasn't that person anymore. He had a choice to make. He glanced at the papers in front of him, her resume, her application, her credentials. There was no denying she was experienced. Whitman and Associates was one of the top firms in historical research, and whether he liked it or not, Ms. Whitman was a seasoned academic. Still, he couldn't ignore the past. The thought whispered in his mind, tempting him. He could reject her outright. He could make her feel what he had felt. But then another thought surfaced. For years, Ms. Whitman had tried to keep him small, to make him believe he wasn't good enough. But here he was, sitting in the seat of power. That, in itself, was the ultimate victory. Elijah exhaled slowly and picked up his pen. "Ms. Whitman, let's discuss your qualifications." She straightened, clearly regaining confidence. "Of course. As you know, I've spent over 20 years in the education sector, specializing in American history. My research has been published in several academic journals, and I believe my experience would bring value to this firm. Elijah nodded, keeping his expression neutral. Tell me, Ms. Whitman, what is your philosophy on mentorship? Her eyes flickered, sensing the weight of the question. I believe in guiding students to reach their full potential. Elijah raised an eyebrow. Even if you don't think they belong? A beat of silence. Ms. Whitman shifted uncomfortably. I'm not sure I understand the question. Elijah leaned forward. You told me I didn't belong, Ms. Whitman. You said people like me didn't have the capacity to grasp certain subjects. Do you remember that? She swallowed. I do, Elijah continued, his voice steady but firm. I remember every word. Her hands gripped the arms of her chair. Mr. Carter, if I ever said something that offended you, I assure you it was never my intention. Elijah let out a short, humorless laugh. Your intention doesn't erase the impact, Ms. Whitman. He let the words sink in before adding, Do you still believe what you said? Her mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, she seemed to realize that there was no easy way out of this. She hesitated. I was wrong. Elijah studied her carefully, searching for any trace of insincerity. But to his surprise, she actually looked ashamed. Maybe she never expected to be confronted. Maybe she had convinced herself that she had never been biased, that she had simply been tough on students like him. But now, faced with the consequences of her actions, she had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. For years, he had wanted an apology. But now that it was in front of him, it felt hollow. Words wouldn't change the past, but his actions could shape the future. Elijah tapped his pen against the table, deep in thought. He had two choices: reject her, send her away, make her feel the sting of failure, give her a chance. Not because she deserved it, but because he was better than her expectations of him. He took a deep breath. Ms. Whitman, I won't lie to you. Given our history, this is an uncomfortable situation. She nodded stiffly. But, he continued, this interview isn't about our past. It's about your ability to contribute to this firm. Her eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected him to take the high road. I believe in second chances, Elijah said. But tell me, if I recommend you for this position, will you use it to mentor young scholars without bias? Or will you repeat history? Ms. Whitman hesitated, then nodded. I will do better. Elijah studied her for a long moment. Then, he set his pen down and extended a hand. Then let's see what you can do. Ms. Whitman blinked, clearly stunned. Slowly, she reached out and shook his hand. For the first time, the power dynamic had shifted, not through revenge, but through redemption. And Elijah Carter had won. Elijah Carter left the interview room feeling lighter than he had in years. He had walked into that room with the power to humiliate Ms. Whitman, to make her feel the pain she had inflicted upon him. But instead, he had chosen something far greater: grace. His decision spread through the office quickly. Colleagues who had overheard parts of the interview murmured about it, some admiring his restraint, others questioning why he hadn't dismissed her outright. But Elijah didn't concern himself with their opinions. That night, as he sat in his small apartment, staring out at the city skyline, he realized something profound. He had broken the cycle. For years, Ms. Whitman had tried to define his worth, tried to limit him to her narrow perception of what someone like him could achieve. And yet, here he was, offering her a second chance. It wasn't about her. It was about him. And he had chosen to be the kind of man who led with integrity. In the weeks that followed, Ms. Whitman's presence at the firm became a quiet topic of discussion. People watched her, curious about how she would adapt to her new role. Elijah observed her from a distance. She no longer carried herself with the arrogance she once had. She listened more than she spoke, carefully considering the perspectives of the younger scholars around her. One afternoon, as he passed by the research wing, he caught a glimpse of her sitting with a young intern, a black woman, deep in conversation over historical texts. He paused, listening. I see where I went wrong in my previous work, Ms. Whitman admitted. I focused too much on traditional narratives and ignored the voices that weren't included in textbooks. I'm trying to correct that now. Elijah exhaled slowly. It wasn't an apology, but it was something better. One evening, Elijah received an unexpected email. It was from Ms. Whitman. He hesitated before opening it. Mr. Carter, I don't expect forgiveness, nor do I assume I've earned it. But I want you to know that your decision that day forced me to confront who I was. I spent years believing I was tough but fair, that my actions were justified. You showed me the truth. You had every reason to turn me away, and yet you gave me the opportunity to do better. I won't waste it. Thank you for showing me the kind of person I never had the courage to be. Elijah stared at the screen for a long time. Then, he simply closed the email and leaned back, feeling a quiet sense of peace. Months later, Elijah found himself back at his old high school for an alumni event. The hallways felt smaller than he remembered, the memories of his time there a distant echo. He passed by Ms. Whitman's old classroom. A new teacher had taken over, a young woman with bright eyes and an open demeanor, speaking passionately to her students about history. Elijah smiled. The past no longer had power over him. He had built something greater, and he was just getting started. Months had passed since that fateful interview, and life had moved forward. Ms. Whitman had settled into her role at Whitman and Associates, her presence no longer the uncomfortable scandal it once was. People noticed the change in her. She was quieter, more introspective, more willing to listen. Elijah, too, had grown. The experience had solidified something in him. He was no longer defined by the past. One afternoon, as he walked through the firm's corridors, he passed Ms. Whitman's office. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, she sat at her desk, surrounded by books and research papers. She was speaking to a group of interns, her voice measured, her expression softer than he had ever seen. I used to believe history was just about names and dates, she said. But history is about people. Their struggles, their voices, their resilience. I failed to see that before. I won't make that mistake again. Elijah paused, a small smile forming at the corner of his lips. She was still learning, still growing. He had given her the opportunity to be better, and she had taken it. With a nod to himself, Elijah walked on. Later that evening, Elijah sat alone in his apartment, reflecting on everything that had transpired. He had always believed that revenge would be the ultimate justice, that making Ms. Whitman suffer would somehow balance the scales. But now he saw the truth. The greatest power isn't in tearing others down. It's in proving them wrong, not through hate, but through success, through grace. Ms. Whitman's transformation didn't erase the past, but it proved something important. People can change, if given the chance. Not all would. Not all deserved to. But he had been given chances before. Mentors, friends, people who saw potential in him when others refused. If they had let resentment guide them, if they had refused to help him because of someone else's prejudice, would he have made it this far? That was the lesson. Change starts when someone dares to break the cycle. And Elijah had broken it. The next morning, Elijah sat at his desk, sipping coffee as the city buzzed outside his window. He thought about the students who still sat in those high school classrooms, facing teachers who might doubt them, who might belittle them. He thought about the people still carrying anger, still waiting for a chance to strike back at those who had wronged them. And he wished he could tell them what he had learned. You don't have to let hatred shape you. You don't have to carry their cruelty like a burden. The best revenge isn't vengeance at all. It's success. It's kindness. It's choosing to rise above. Elijah had walked into that interview with the power to destroy. He had walked out with the power to change. And that made all the difference.